The morning sun painted the tarmac at Bagram Airfield in shades of amber and shadow when Lieutenant Commander Vera Ghost Nakamura first heard the screaming. It wasn't the usual chaos of a forward operating base. This was different, desperate, raw. She had been walking toward her FA-18F Super Hornet, helmet tucked under her arm, mind focused on the routine reconnaissance mission ahead. The kind of milk run that higher-ups gave to pilots they didn't quite trust with the real action. Then the Black Hawk appeared over the perimeter wall, trailing smoke like a wounded bird. Its rotor wash sent dust devils spiraling across the runway as it made an emergency landing barely 50 yards from where Vera stood. The side door burst open before the skids touched concrete, and that's when she saw him, a Navy SEAL, his tactical vest dark with blood, stumbling out of the helicopter and collapsing directly in her path. For a heartbeat, time crystallized. The SEAL's eyes found hers through his cracked visor, and in that instant she read everything. The failed mission the teammates left behind, the coordinates burned into his memory like a brand. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear over the helicopter's dying whine, but she didn't need to. She'd seen that look before, in her own reflection, 3 years ago after Somalia. Medic! The shout erupted from somewhere behind her, but Vera was already kneeling beside the wounded warrior. His hands shot out, gripping her flight suit with surprising strength, and he whispered a grid reference that would change everything. Package, still alive. They're coming back for us. The medics arrived, professional and efficient, but as they loaded the SEAL onto a stretcher, his eyes never left Vera's face. She understood. This wasn't about protocol or chain of command. This was about warriors who didn't leave their own behind. As the medical team rushed him toward the field hospital, Vera remained crouched on the tarmac, staring at the blood-stained concrete where he'd fallen. That's when Colonel Marcus Webb approached, his weathered face grim with the weight of impossible decisions. "Ghost, forget the recon flight. We need to talk." His voice carried the kind of authority that brooked no argument but also something else, respect, maybe even hope. In the distance, the wounded SEAL disappeared through the hospital doors, but his whispered coordinates echoed in Vera's mind like a prayer. She stood slowly, dust swirling around her boots, and followed Webb toward the operations center. Neither of them spoke, but both understood that everything had just changed. The routine mission was forgotten. The real war was about to begin. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the airfield. Somewhere in those shadows, Ghost Nakamura's legend was taking its first breath. The operations center hummed with controlled tension when Vera entered behind Colonel Webb. Banks of monitors displayed satellite feeds, weather patterns, and threat assessments in an electronic constellation that never slept. Webb gestured toward a secure briefing room where 3 other officers waited, all men, all skeptical expressions that Vera had grown accustomed to reading like weather patterns. "Gentlemen, meet your pilot," Webb announced without preamble. The silence that followed could have been cut with a Ka-Bar knife. Major Rick Santos, the mission commander, shifted in his chair with barely concealed irritation. Captain Joel Briggs, the intelligence officer, didn't even look up from his tablet. Only Lieutenant Colonel Dave Morrison, the operations officer, met her eyes directly, and what she saw there wasn't encouraging. "Sir, with respect," Santos began, his Texas drawl thick with diplomatic protest, "we need someone with combat experience for this kind of operation. Ghost's record shows mostly transport and reconnaissance flights." The words hung in the air like smoke from a burned bridge. Vera had heard variations of this speech more times than she cared to count, but it still stung like salt in an open wound. Webb's expression never changed. Ghost's record also shows she's the only pilot on this base who's successfully extracted friendlies from a hot LZ under fire. Somalia, 3 years ago. 4 Marines who shouldn't have made it home are eating breakfast with their families this morning because of her. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Briggs finally looked up from his tablet, studying Vera with the calculating gaze of someone reassessing a chess position. "The package is a 6-man SEAL team, Call say Neptune 6, compromised during a high-value target operation in the Kunar province. They've been playing cat and mouse with Taliban fighters for 18 hours. Intel suggests they're pinned down in a compound approximately here. He indicated a position on the wall-mounted map with a laser pointer. The red dot trembled slightly against the topographical lines, betraying Briggs' own nervousness about the mission. The problem is altitude. The compound sits at 9,000 feet, surrounded by peaks that reach nearly 15,000. Weather's deteriorating, and we've got a narrow window before it closes completely. Morrison leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the table. Standard extraction protocols won't work. The terrain's too rough for a conventional helicopter approach, and the Taliban have moved surface-to-air missiles into the area. We need someone who can thread the needle, get in fast, low, and dirty. Vera absorbed the tactical picture with practiced efficiency, her mind already calculating approach vectors and escape routes. The coordinates the wounded SEAL had whispered matched Briggs' briefing exactly. Neptune 6 was trapped in a kill zone, and every minute of delay increased their chances of coming home in body bags. "What's our asset package?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. Webb smiled for the first time since she'd entered the room, a predatory expression that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly that question. The tactical brief unfolded like a deadly puzzle with too many missing pieces. Vera would be flying solo. No wingman, no backup, no cavalry riding to the rescue if things went sideways. Her aircraft, a specially modified FA-18F Super Hornet designated Phantom 7, had been stripped down and reconfigured for precision close air support. Extra fuel tanks replaced some of the standard ordnance load, trading firepower for the range necessary to reach the extraction point and return. "The bird's been fitted with enhanced communications gear," Morrison explained, pulling up technical specifications on his tablet. "You'll have direct contact with Neptune 6, plus real-time satellite imagery. But here's the catch. The mountains will play hell with your GPS, and the weather front moving in will kill your satellite link within 4 hours." Santos spread a detailed topographical chart across the briefing table, his thick fingers tracing the planned flight path. "You'll ingress here, following the valley floor to stay below radar coverage. The compound is built into a ridge face, natural fortification, but it also means limited approach options. The SEALs have marked a landing zone approximately 200 meters south of their position, but intelligence indicates it's under direct fire." Vera studied the chart with the intensity of a surgeon examining an X-ray. The flight path wound through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced pilot, narrow valleys, unpredictable wind shears, and mountainsides that rose like stone walls on either side of her aircraft. One miscalculation, one moment of inattention, and Phantom 7 would become a smoking crater scattered across the Hindu Kush. "Time on station?" she asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. 15 minutes maximum," Briggs replied grimly. "After that, you'll be flying on fumes. The refueling tanker will be orbiting here." He indicated a position nearly 200 miles away, "but you'll have to reach it on whatever fuel remains." Webb watched Vera's face carefully as the full scope of the mission became clear. This wasn't just an extraction. It was a suicide run disguised as a rescue operation. The kind of mission that ended careers, relationships, and sometimes lives. The kind of mission that separated the warriors from the wannabes. "There's one more thing," Morrison added quietly. "The Taliban commander in the area is Ahmed Massoud, nephew of the famous Northern Alliance leader, and twice as ruthless. Intelligence suggests he's turned this into a personal vendetta. He's not just trying to kill Neptune 6, he's trying to capture them alive. The propaganda value would be immense." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Vera's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained steady. "When do we launch?" Webb checked his watch. "Wheels up in 30 minutes. Weather window closes at 1400 hours. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. Ghost, nobody would blame you if you walked away from this one. It's not exactly a textbook operation. For a moment, Vera was back in Somalia, watching her wingman's aircraft disappear in a ball of orange flame while Marines screamed for extraction over the radio. She'd made a choice that day, the same choice she was making now. Vera's boots echoed against the hangar floor as she walked toward Phantom 7, her survival gear weighing heavy on her shoulders. The ground crew had worked through the night, and their faces showed the exhaustion of men who understood that lives depended on their precision. Chief Petty Officer Martinez approached with her pre-flight checklist, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of the mission. "She's ready, Ghost," Martinez said simply, but his eyes conveyed volumes. This crew chief had prepped aircraft for hundreds of combat missions, and he'd never lost a pilot to mechanical failure. His reputation was built on such reliability, and today that reputation would be tested alongside Vera's flying skills. The Super Hornet crouched on the tarmac like a predator waiting to strike. Its twin engines gleamed in the morning sun, and the additional fuel tanks gave it an asymmetrical appearance that spoke of compromise and adaptation. Someone had stenciled Neptune's chariot beneath the cockpit in small letters, an unauthorized addition that made Vera smile despite the circumstances. "Comms check," came Webb's voice through her helmet radio as she strapped into the cockpit. The familiar ritual of pre-flight procedures helped calm her nerves, each switch and button a small act of faith in the machine that would carry her into harm's way. "Phantom 7, solid copy," she replied, her hands moving through the startup sequence with practiced efficiency. The engine spooled up with a rising whine that vibrated through her bones, and suddenly the abstract briefing became terrifyingly real. In minutes, she would be alone over some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, with 6 American lives hanging in the balance. "Neptune 6, this is Phantom 7, radio check," she transmitted on the tactical frequency. Static answered her for several heartbeats, and she felt her pulse quicken. Then a voice emerged from the electronic noise, tired, professional, and unmistakably American. "Phantom 7, Neptune 6 actual, we hear you Lima Charlie. Situation unchanged, we're still breathing but barely. How copy?" "Neptune 6, solid copy. Phantom 7 inbound your position, time on station 15 minutes. Be advised weather's deteriorating. We need to make this count." "Roger that, Phantom. We'll have the LZ marked when you arrive. Just get here fast. These guys aren't giving up easy." The finality of the transmission sent a chill through Vera's spine. She could hear the exhaustion in the SEAL team leader's voice, the edge that came with too many hours under fire and too many close calls. These weren't just coordinates on a map anymore. They were 6 warriors counting on her to bring them home. "Tower, Phantom 7 requesting immediate departure, Vector 270. Phantom 7 Tower, you are cleared for immediate takeoff, Vector 270. Godspeed, Ghost." The tower controller's blessing carried an unusual warmth, and Vera realized that word of the mission had spread through the base. She wasn't just another pilot on another sortie. She was the cavalry, riding to the rescue of America's finest. The afterburners ignited with a controlled explosion of power, pressing her back into her ejection seat as Phantom 7 accelerated down the runway. The ground fell away beneath her, and within seconds she was climbing through thin mountain air toward an uncertain fate in the clouds above the Hindu Kush. The landscape below transformed from the organized chaos of Bagram Airfield to the raw, unforgiving beauty of Afghanistan's mountains. Vera banked northwest, following the planned route that would take her through valleys carved by millennia of wind and water. Her radar painted the terrain ahead in electronic green lines, but she knew that in these mountains, electronics were only as good as the last satellite update. "Phantom 7 AWACS, we show you on course, airspeed 400 knots. Be advised, weather front approaching from the west. You've got approximately 90 minutes before conditions become non-flyable. The airborne warning and control system aircraft orbiting far behind her represented the last link to friendly forces. Once she entered the deep valleys of the Kunar province, she would be alone with her aircraft, her skills, and her determination to bring 6 SEALs home alive. The first mountain peaks rose around her like stone monuments to human insignificance. At this altitude, the air was thin enough to make the engines work harder, and Vera constantly monitored her fuel consumption. Every gallon burned was one less available for the critical moments ahead, when she would need power for evasive maneuvers and the climb back to safer altitude. Neptune 6 Phantom 7. Crossing Checkpoint Alpha, inbound your position 20 minutes. Copy Phantom. Situation update. We've taken 2 wounded, 1 seriously. The LZ is taking intermittent fire, but we can suppress it when you arrive. Just need to know your approach vector so we don't accidentally shoot at the good guys. Vera's stomach tightened. Wounded meant complications, slower movement, higher stakes. A seriously wounded SEAL would require medical attention that only Bagram's field hospital could provide, and every minute of delay decreased his chances of survival. Neptune 6 approaching from the south, low and fast. Mark your position with strobes when you hear my engines. How copy? Solid copy, Phantom. We'll light it up like Christmas when you arrive. The radio fell silent except for the subtle hiss of static and distant voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize. Taliban communications, probably. The enemy discussing their plans for the Americans trapped in the compound ahead. Vera adjusted her course slightly, threading the needle between 2 massive peaks that seemed to reach toward her aircraft with stone fingers. Below, shadows moved across slopes covered in loose rock and scrub vegetation. No roads, no settlements, no signs of civilization except for the occasional goat path etched into the mountainside. This was country where men had been fighting and dying for centuries, where the strong survived, and the weak became cautionary tales told around campfires. Her navigation system chimed a soft warning, 5 minutes to target. Vera began her descent, trading altitude for speed as she prepared for what would either be a perfect extraction or a very short, very violent end to her military career. The compound appeared suddenly around a bend in the valley, exactly where intelligence had predicted, but somehow more forbidding than the satellite photographs had suggested. Built into a natural shelf of rock, it commanded excellent fields of fire in 3 directions and could only be approached from the south, exactly the route Vera was flying. Muzzle flashes twinkled like deadly stars from positions around the compound's perimeter, and she could see the tactical situation at a glance. Neptune 6 was pinned down in the main building, while Taliban fighters occupied fortified positions in the surrounding terrain. The marked landing zone was a flat area of bare rock approximately the size of a tennis court, situated between the compound and a precipitous drop into the valley below. Neptune 6, Phantom 7. I have visual on your position. Beginning attack run on hostile positions north of the LZ. Roger, Phantom. We're ready to move on your signal. Vera lined up her first target, a heavy machine gun position that commanded the approach to the landing zone. Her finger found the trigger for the aircraft's 20 cannon, and she felt the familiar vibration as hundreds of rounds per minute reached out toward the enemy position. The cannon fire stitched across the rocky slope like a deadly sewing machine, sending up plumes of dust and debris. The machine gun fell silent, but immediately 2 more positions opened fire, their tracers reaching up toward her aircraft like angry fireflies. Vera banked hard left, using the terrain to break visual contact while she repositioned for another attack run. Good hits, Phantom. That gun position is neutralized. We're moving toward the LZ now. Through her targeting system, Vera watched 6 figures emerge from the compound and begin bounding toward the landing zone in classic fire and maneuver formation. Even from this altitude, she could see that two of them were moving slower than the others, the wounded SEALs that Neptune 6 Actual had mentioned. More Taliban fighters appeared from concealed positions, their AK-47s chattering angrily as they tried to intercept the escaping Americans. Vera rolled into another attack run, her 20 cannon carving a path of destruction between the SEALs and their pursuers. Phantom 7, we're taking fire from the East Ridge. Can you suppress that position? Vera's eyes swept the eastern slope until she found the source, a group of fighters with an RPG launcher who were lining up a shot at the exposed SEALs. Her hands moved across the weapons panel with practiced efficiency, selecting a small diameter bomb that would eliminate the threat without risking her own aircraft to ground fire. The weapon fell away from her aircraft like a dart thrown by an angry god. 2 seconds later, the eastern ridge erupted in flame and smoke, silencing the RPG team permanently. Outstanding, Phantom. We're at the LZ ready for pickup. But even as Vera acknowledged the transmission, she knew their troubles were far from over. The landing zone materialized beneath Phantom 7's nose like a postage stamp pasted to the side of a mountain. Vera had performed countless carrier landings in her career, touching down on flight decks that seemed impossibly small from the cockpit of a fast-moving aircraft. But this was different. Aircraft carriers didn't have Taliban fighters shooting at them from multiple directions, and they definitely didn't sit at 9,000 feet above sea level, where the thin air made every maneuver more challenging. Neptune 6 beginning final approach. Pop smoke and clear the LZ. Roger, Phantom, smoke out, LZ is clear. Purple smoke began billowing from the rocky shelf, giving Vera a visual reference for wind direction and speed. The crosswind was stronger than she'd anticipated, and she made minute corrections to her approach angle while simultaneously monitoring the tactical situation around the compound. Her aircraft's threat warning system began chirping insistently. Someone was painting her with targeting radar, probably a surface-to-air missile launcher positioned somewhere in the surrounding peaks. Vera ignored the warning for the moment, focusing entirely on the delicate task of setting 30 tons of combat aircraft down on a piece of ground that nature never intended for aviation operations. The landing gear touched stone with a jarring impact that rattled her teeth, and immediately Vera began the process of keeping Phantom 7 from sliding off the mountain. The aircraft's brakes screamed against the rocky surface, while the engine spooled down from landing power to idle. Through her canopy, she could see the 6 SEALs sprinting toward her aircraft, 2 of them supporting a third who was clearly struggling to stay upright. Move, move, move. The team leader's voice crackled through her radio, but Vera could also hear him shouting the same command to his men as they closed the distance to her aircraft. Bullets sparked off the rocks around the landing zone, and she realized that the Taliban fighters were repositioning to bring the SEALs under more effective fire. The first SEAL reached her aircraft and immediately began helping his wounded teammate into the narrow confines of the Super Hornet's rear seat. The 2-seat FA-18F hadn't been designed for this kind of mission, but creative modifications by the ground crew had created enough space for the rescued personnel. Barely. Hurry up, Vera called over the intercom, watching her fuel gauges with growing concern. The approach and landing had consumed more fuel than planned, leaving her with razor-thin margins for the flight back to Bagram. Every second on the ground was a second she couldn't afford to lose. More SEALs piled into the aircraft with practiced efficiency, their movements economical despite the chaos erupting around them. The team leader was the last to board, pausing for a moment to return fire at pursuing Taliban fighters before sliding into the cramped passenger compartment. Neptune 6 aboard, Phantom. Get us out of here. Vera was already advancing the throttles before the words left his mouth. The engines responded with a rising whine that echoed off the surrounding mountainsides, and Phantom 7 began its takeoff roll across the makeshift landing zone. The aircraft gathered speed grudgingly in the thin air, and Vera held her breath as the end of the rocky shelf approached with terrifying speed. The Super Hornet lifted off with mere yards to spare, its landing gear retracting just as the aircraft passed over the edge of the precipice. Below them, the valley floor lay 3,000 feet down, more than enough altitude to kill everyone aboard if something went wrong during the critical first moments of flight. "We're airborne," Vera announced, banking away from the compound as rifle fire snapped past her canopy. The immediate threat was behind them, but she knew their challenges were just beginning. The weather front that AWACS had warned about was beginning to move into the area, and already she could see dark clouds building over the peaks ahead. The wounded SEAL in the back was unconscious now, his teammates working frantically to keep him alive during the flight to medical treatment. Vera pushed Phantom 7 to maximum cruise speed, trading fuel economy for the time that might mean the difference between life and death for the injured warrior. "Bagram, Phantom 7 with 6 precious souls inbound your position. We need priority handling and a medical team standing by." "Phantom 7 Bagram, medical team is prepped and waiting. You are cleared direct approach Vector 110. Welcome home, Ghost." The controller's voice carried a warmth that told Vera the entire base was following their progress. She had carried out what many would have considered an impossible mission, extracting 6 SEALs from a hostile environment under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced combat pilot. But as she looked at her fuel gauges and the weather building ahead, Vera knew they weren't home yet. The hardest part might still be ahead of them. The flight back to Bagram became a race against time, weather, and physics. Vera's fuel gauges showed critical levels, and the storm front was closing in faster than the meteorologists had predicted. Dark clouds towered above the mountain peaks like black monuments to nature's power, and lightning flickered in their depths with ominous regularity. Phantom 7 AWACS were showing severe weather cells directly on your route home. Recommend deviation to the north. Vera checked her navigation display and calculated the fuel burn for the alternate route. The numbers weren't encouraging. A northern deviation would add precious minutes to their flight time, minutes she couldn't afford with her current fuel state. But flying through the storm would be equally dangerous, especially with 6 additional souls aboard her aircraft. "AWACS negative on the deviation. I don't have the fuel for a northern route. We're going through." "Roger, Phantom 7. Be advised, we're showing severe turbulence and possible icing conditions. Maintain radio contact." In the rear seat, the SEALs continued their desperate efforts to keep their wounded teammate alive. Vera could hear the team medic calling out vitals over the intercom, his voice tight with professional concern. The wounded SEAL's blood pressure was dropping, and without immediate surgical intervention, he might not survive the flight to Bagram. "How long to the field hospital?" asked the team leader, "Call say Neptune 6 actual." 22 minutes, Vera replied, pushing the throttles forward despite the impact on fuel consumption. 22 minutes might as well have been 22 hours if the wounded man didn't receive proper medical care. The first wisps of cloud began streaming past her canopy as Phantom 7 entered the storm system. Turbulence buffeted the aircraft like an invisible giant shaking a toy, and Vera fought to maintain control while the SEALs in back braced themselves against the violent motion. "Jesus Christ," someone muttered over the intercom as a particularly severe jolt threw them against their restraints. Vera didn't respond. All of her attention was focused on keeping the aircraft upright and on course through conditions that were rapidly deteriorating. Ice began forming on the leading edges of her wings, disrupting the carefully engineered airflow that kept 30 tons of metal and human cargo aloft. The aircraft's anti-ice system cycled on automatically, but Vera could feel Phantom 7 becoming sluggish as additional ice accumulated faster than the heating elements could remove it. "Phantom 7, you're drifting south of course. came AWACS's voice through heavy static. The storm was interfering with radio communications now, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. Copy AWACS, correcting north. Vera banked left, using visual references through brief breaks in the clouds to navigate toward Bagram. Her GPS system was jumping erratically, confused by the electromagnetic interference generated by the storm cells around them. A massive downdraft caught the aircraft without warning, dropping them nearly 1,000 feet in seconds. The SEALs shouted in alarm as their stomachs pressed against their spines, and Vera heard medical equipment rattling around the passenger compartment as the team medic struggled to maintain his treatment of the wounded man. "Everyone okay back there?" Vera called, fighting to regain lost altitude while the engine strained against the turbulent air. "Still breathing," Neptune 6 Actual replied grimly. "But barely. We need to get on the ground soon." Vera's fuel warning light began flashing, 10 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rates. She was committed now, with no alternatives except to reach Bagram or find a suitable crash landing site in the mountains below. Neither option offered much comfort as the storm continued to batter their aircraft with indifferent violence. Then, through a gap in the clouds, she saw the most beautiful sight in aviation: runway lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope in an ocean of uncertainty. The approach to Bagram unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between pilot, aircraft, and ground control. Vera's hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision, configuring Phantom 7 for landing while simultaneously monitoring the condition of her passengers and the critical fuel situation that left no room for error. Bagram Tower, Phantom 7 on final approach. Declare emergency for medical priority and minimum fuel. Phantom 7 Tower, you are cleared for immediate landing runway 21. Emergency crews are standing by. Medical team is positioned and ready. Outstanding work, Ghost. The controller's praise felt premature. They weren't safely on the ground yet, and with fuel levels hovering just above zero, even a small mistake could turn triumph into tragedy. Vera lined up with the runway centerline, her eyes constantly scanning between the approach lights ahead and the fuel gauges that seemed to be dropping toward empty with each passing second. "Gear down, flaps down on speed," she announced, running through the landing checklist with automatic precision. Behind her, the SEALs had fallen silent except for the continued medical treatment of their wounded teammate. The team medic's voice had taken on an urgency that suggested they were rapidly running out of time. "Blood pressure dropping, pulse thread. We need to get him to surgery now," the medic reported, his words clipped and professional despite the desperation underlying them. Phantom 7 touched down on Bagram's runway with the gentlest contact Vera had ever achieved, as if the aircraft itself understood the precious cargo it carried. The main gear kissed the asphalt with barely a whisper, followed by the nose gear settling with equal delicacy. She immediately began the landing roll, simultaneously shutting down unnecessary systems to conserve the last few gallons of fuel in her tanks. Tower, Phantom 7 safely on deck, requesting immediate taxi to the medical facility. Roger, Phantom 7. Follow the emergency vehicles to the hospital. Medical team is moving to your position now. Even before the aircraft came to a complete stop, Vera could see the medical team sprinting toward them with a stretcher and emergency equipment. The ground crew chief, Martinez, was running alongside the medical personnel, his face showing the relief of a man whose pilot had just returned safely from an impossible mission. The canopy opened with a hydraulic whine, and immediately the sounds of organized chaos filled the cockpit. Medical personnel swarmed around the aircraft as the SEALs carefully extracted their wounded teammate from the rear compartment. The team leader paused for a moment as he climbed out, meeting Vera's eyes through her helmet visor. "Thank you," he said simply, but those two words carried the weight of 6 lives saved, and a mission accomplished against impossible odds. Vera nodded, suddenly too exhausted to speak. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the past hour was beginning to fade, leaving behind the bone-deep fatigue that followed extreme stress. She watched as the medical team loaded the wounded SEAL onto a stretcher and rushed him toward the field hospital, his teammates jogging alongside and continuing to provide critical information to the surgeons who would determine his fate. "Ghost, hell of a job," Martinez called up to her, his weathered face split by an enormous grin. "Fuel gauges show you landed with less than 50 gallons remaining. That's cutting it closer than a barber's razor." Vera began the post-flight shutdown procedures, her hands moving through the familiar routine while her mind processed what had just occurred. She had extracted 6 Navy SEALs from hostile territory, flown through a storm system that should have been impossible to navigate, and landed with fuel margins that would have been considered reckless under any other circumstances. But they were all alive, all safe, and the wounded SEAL was now receiving the medical care that would hopefully save his life. As far as Vera was concerned, that made it a perfect mission. The post-mission debrief took place in the same operations center where Vera had received her initial briefing, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Where skepticism and doubt had dominated the morning's meeting, respect and admiration now filled the room. Colonel Webb sat at the head of the conference table, his expression mixing relief with professional pride, while the other officers who had questioned Vera's qualifications now studied her with obvious reassessment. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present Ghost Nakamura, the pilot who just pulled off one of the most audacious combat rescues in recent memory," Webb announced as Vera entered the room. The applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt, but Vera felt uncomfortable with the attention. In her mind, she had simply done her job, the same job that hundreds of other military pilots performed every day around the world. Major Santos, who had expressed the strongest reservations about her capabilities, stood and extended his hand. "Ghost, I owe you an apology, and a debt of gratitude. Those SEALs are some of the finest warriors I've ever worked with, and you brought them home alive." "Just doing my job, sir," Vera replied, accepting the handshake. But Santos shook his head, his expression serious. "No, this was far beyond the call of duty. The weather conditions alone should have made that mission impossible, and the fuel margins," he trailed off, apparently unable to find words for what she had accomplished. Captain Briggs consulted his tablet, pulling up the mission data that had been automatically recorded by Phantom 7 systems. "The telemetry shows some remarkable flying. You maintained precise navigation through zero visibility conditions, executed multiple attack runs in hostile territory, and landed on an improvised strip that most pilots wouldn't attempt in perfect weather." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he considered the tactical implications. The extraction itself was textbook perfect, but the flight home. How did you navigate through that storm system? GPS was unreliable, communications were marginal, and the turbulence should have made controlled flight nearly impossible. Vera considered the question carefully. How did she explain the instinctive feel for her aircraft that came from years of experience, the ability to read weather patterns through subtle changes in air pressure and wind direction, the countless hours of training that had prepared her for exactly this kind of challenge? "Experience," she said finally, "and a little luck." Webb smiled at her characteristic understatement. "Ghost, I've been flying military aircraft for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished today. The Air Force is recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Navy SEALs are putting in their own commendation." The mention of awards made Vera uncomfortable. She hadn't risked her life for recognition or medals. She had done it because 6 American warriors needed someone to bring them home, and she happened to be the pilot available for the mission. "How's the wounded SEAL?" she asked, changing the subject to what really mattered. "Stable," Morrison replied. The surgeons say he'll make a full recovery thanks to the speed of your extraction. Another 30 minutes on the ground and they might not have been able to save him. The knowledge that her flying had directly contributed to saving a life brought Vera more satisfaction than any medal ever could. This was why she had joined the military, why she had endured the skepticism and doubt of colleagues who questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. Moments like this made every challenge worthwhile. 3 weeks later, the ceremony took place on a sun-baked parade ground at Bagram Airfield. The entire base had turned out to witness the presentation of the Distinguished Flying Cross to Lieutenant Commander Vera "Ghost" Nakamura, and the crowd included not only her fellow aviators, but also ground crews, support personnel, and 6 Navy SEALs who had insisted on attending despite being officially reassigned to other duties. The SEAL team leader, whose real name Vera had learned was Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, stood at attention in the front row wearing dress blues that emphasized the multiple combat decorations spanning his chest. His left arm was still in a sling from wounds sustained during the mission, but he had refused medical leave to attend the ceremony.